When a wealthy socialite publicly accuses Big Shaq, a former NBA star turned community hero, of running a fraudulent food truck, the world turns against him. The media erupts, authorities shut him down, and the very people he fed begin to doubt him. But when a homeless man with a secret and an outspoken journalist uncover a hidden conspiracy, Shaq fights back. As the truth unravels, revealing a twisted real estate scheme, deception, and betrayal, the same crowd that cheered his downfall is left stunned. How far will some go to silence a good man? And when the truth finally comes out, who will pay the price? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the bustling streets of Hollowbrook, a small but struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The aroma of freshly grilled chicken, seasoned rice, and warm bread filled the air, drawing in families, weary workers, and the occasional passerby who couldn't resist the scent of a good meal. At the center of it all stood Big Shaq, a towering figure with broad shoulders and a heart even bigger than his frame. His food truck, Shaq's Table, was more than just a place to grab a bite. It was a beacon of hope in a place where hope had long been in short supply. The bright blue truck, decorated with images of smiling families and steaming plates of food, was parked right in the heart of the community, where it had become a daily lifeline for many. No one left hungry on Big Shaq's watch. Shaq, a former NBA superstar, had once lived in the world of flashing cameras, million-dollar endorsements, and sold-out arenas. But fame had never mattered to him as much as purpose. After retiring, he poured his energy and his savings into something meaningful, feeding those who needed it most. "All right, who's next?" Shaq's deep, booming voice rang out as he handed a hot plate to a young boy, Lucas, no older than 8, who held his little sister's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Shaq." Lucas beamed, gripping the meal like a treasure. His sister, barely 5, clutched a toy in one hand and clung to her brother with the other. Shaq ruffled the boy's hair. "You take care of your sister now, champ, and make sure you both eat up, all right?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically, his eyes filled with admiration before he and his sister darted back to their mother, who stood nearby with tears in her eyes. Behind Shaq, his small but dedicated team worked tirelessly. DeAndre, his right-hand man, kept the grill sizzling, flipping chicken and stirring pots of rice. Maria, a local volunteer, packaged the meals with efficiency, her hands moving in sync with the rhythm of the operation. "Shaq, we're running low on bread," Maria called out over the clatter of plates. Shaq wiped his brow and turned toward the storage crates. "I got it." He hoisted a fresh bag of bread onto the counter just as a shadow fell over the food truck. Jessica Harper stood at a distance, her arms folded across her expensive wool coat. She was the kind of woman who walked like she owned the pavement beneath her feet, her designer heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk. Her icy blue eyes scanned the scene with thinly veiled disdain. Jessica wasn't from Hollowbrook. She lived in the more affluent part of town, a place where private security patrolled the streets, and organic grocery stores stocked imported cheeses and wine priced higher than most people's rent in this neighborhood. She had no business being here, except for the fact that she made it her business to look down on those who struggled. She tilted her chin and exhaled sharply, watching the line of people receiving their free meals. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to no one in particular. Beside her, a middle-aged woman named Janet, who lived just 2 streets over, turned her head. "Excuse me?" Jessica gestured toward the truck with a dismissive flick of her manicured hand. "All of this. Free handouts. You really think it's helping?" Janet frowned. "Of course it's helping. Some of us don't know where our next meal is coming from." Jessica scoffed. "Maybe if people worked a little harder, they wouldn't have to rely on charity." Janet's expression darkened. "You don't know anything about what people go through." Jessica smirked. "I know enough. People like him." She nodded toward Shaq. "Always have an angle. No one does this out of the goodness of their heart. There's always something they're getting in return." Janet's patience wore thin. "You don't even live here. Why do you care?" Jessica took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Because when you hand out food like this, you make people dependent. You encourage laziness. Do you really want your neighborhood turning into a place where people just wait for free stuff instead of working for it?" Before Janet could respond, Shaq's voice cut through the tension. "Everything all right over here?" Jessica turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Shaq towered over her, but his presence wasn't intimidating, it was commanding. His posture was relaxed, but there was an unmistakable authority in his stance. Jessica didn't flinch. Just having a conversation. Shaq folded his arms. Looked more like an argument. Jessica tilted her head. You know, you should be careful with all this generosity, Shaq. It's a slippery slope. Give people too much, and they'll start expecting it. Shaq's jaw tightened for a moment before he exhaled slowly. He wasn't new to this kind of talk. He'd heard it before, always from people who had never known hunger. I don't expect anything in return, he said simply. I just make sure people eat. Jessica smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's the problem. She turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking as she disappeared into the crowd. Shaq watched her go, his expression unreadable. DeAndre came up beside him, shaking his head. She's got some nerve, DeAndre muttered. Shaq let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. She's got an opinion, that's for sure. DeAndre flipped a burger with unnecessary force. She's got something else too, a problem with seeing people get help. Shaq didn't argue. He just turned back to the line and kept serving, but a nagging feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. Something told him that Jessica Harper wasn't done yet. And he was right. The afternoon sun had started its slow descent, casting long shadows across the pavement as the scent of grilled chicken and warm bread filled the air. The line outside Shaq's table stretched down the block, families eagerly awaiting their turn to receive a meal. Laughter and conversation, mixed with the occasional honk of passing cars, creating a hum of life in a neighborhood where struggle was an everyday reality. Big Shaq worked with the rhythm of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, his large hands moving swiftly as he handed out plates, his deep voice warm and welcoming. He took a moment to crack a joke with a teenager, fist bumped an elderly man who had been coming here for weeks, and even slipped an extra cookie into a little girl's hand when her mother wasn't looking. This was more than just a food truck. It was a place where people felt seen, respected. Then came the sound of heels clicking against concrete, the steady, deliberate kind that made people turn their heads before they even knew why. Jessica Harper stepped forward, her icy blue eyes scanning the scene like a queen surveying a kingdom she did not approve of. Her lips curled slightly, the same way someone might react to a bad smell. The expensive wool coat draped over her shoulders was a stark contrast to the worn jackets and second-hand clothes of the people around her. She stopped just short of the food truck, her presence alone shifting the energy of the line. A few people exchanged wary glances, already sensing trouble. Then, she spoke. Must be nice, huh? Her voice carried easily over the noise, dripping with sarcasm. Playing the hero, handing out food like some kind of savior? The line grew quieter. Conversations slowed. Even the sizzle of the grill seemed to dim as all eyes turned toward Big Shaq. Shaq didn't react right away. He finished handing out a plate to a single mother, holding a baby on her hip, then wiped his hands on a towel before finally turning to face Jessica. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who had heard this kind of talk before. Just making sure folks eat, ma'am, he replied, his deep voice steady. No crime in that. Jessica's smirk widened. Isn't there, though? She turned her gaze toward the crowd. You all ever wonder why he's really doing this? No one just gives things away for free. People like him always have an angle. A murmur rippled through the line. Some shook their heads, muttering their disapproval, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure. A few voices agreed, quiet but present. She's not wrong, an older man near the back muttered. Ain't nothing in this world free. Shaq's expression remained unreadable. He leaned against the counter of the truck, his massive arms folding across his chest. You got something you want to say, lady? Go ahead and say it. Jessica took a step closer. Oh, I'll say it. You come into this neighborhood, set up shop, and just give things away? What's your end game? You trying to make people dependent on you? Keep them coming back like strays so you can feel good about yourself? A few heads nodded in the crowd. Others frowned in disgust. The tension in the air thickened, a storm waiting to break. Shaq exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Ain't got no end game. Ain't got no angle. I just know what it's like to go to bed hungry. His voice was even, but firm. And I don't want nobody else feeling that if I can help it. Jessica let out a short, humorless laugh. Right. And I'm supposed to believe you do this out of the kindness of your heart? She turned to the crowd, lifting her phone. Y'all really believe this guy? Y'all don't think it's weird? DeAndre, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward from the grill, his expression stormy. What's weird is a lady who don't even live here coming down just to stir up trouble. Jessica's eyes flicked to him. But before she could reply, an older woman, Mrs. Lopez, who had lived in Hollowbrook for over 40 years, spoke up. You got a problem with people getting fed, lady? Mrs. Lopez asked, her tone sharp. Because far as I can tell, you ain't handing out nothing but attitude. Some in the crowd chuckled, but Jessica wasn't fazed. She took a slow, deliberate step back, raising her phone in front of her face. The record button blinked red. You know what? Let's ask the people. Her voice was almost sing-song as she adjusted the angle. The phone's camera pointed straight at Shaq. Meet Big Shaq, Jessica announced. A so-called hero who just loves handing out food. But ask yourself, why? Is he trying to build a brand? Gain influence? Or maybe, just maybe. She let her words hang, teasingly, before dropping the hook. Maybe he's not as generous as he wants you to believe. Shaq's jaw tightened for the first time. Not in anger, but in understanding. He had seen this game before. The twist the story, manipulate the narrative, make good people look bad game. I ain't got nothing to prove to you, Shaq said finally, his voice calm but edged. Jessica just smiled and stopped recording. Well, we'll see what the rest of the world thinks, she said smoothly, lowering her phone. Because something tells me not everyone's gonna buy the whole gentle giant act once they see the truth. With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, phone in hand, her purpose complete. The crowd stood in uneasy silence. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before turning back toward the grill. He had work to do. But just before he could push the moment aside, his gaze caught movement across the street. A man in a black hoodie stood partially hidden behind a lamppost, his face just out of view. He wasn't part of the usual crowd, his posture too stiff, his stance too intentional. And then, just as quickly as Shaq spotted him, the man turned away, raising a phone to his ear before disappearing into the alley. Shaq's gut tightened. He didn't know who the guy was, but something told him he was about to find out. The morning air was crisp, the kind that usually brought a fresh start. But for Big Shaq, it brought nothing but trouble. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating with notification after notification. A dull headache pulsed at the back of his skull as he reached over and squinted at the screen. His heart sank. His name was trending, but not for the right reasons. Food truck scam? Ex-NBA star exploits community for fame. Is Shaq's table just a front? Shaq sat up, scrolling through the chaos unfolding online. His stomach twisted as he clicked on a video. Jessica's video. It had been edited with a manipulative finesse that only someone truly vindictive could craft. She had spliced footage of their argument, cutting out his responses and layering ominous music underneath her words. The captions asked loaded questions. Why is he really here? Who benefits from making the poor dependent? What is Big Shaq hiding? Thousands of angry comments flooded in. People who had never even heard of Hollowbrook now weighing in with opinions, calling him a fraud, a con artist, a self-serving opportunist. Shaq let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. He had been naive to think Jessica was done. Then, a loud knock at the door shattered his thoughts. Shaq's gut told him this wasn't a friendly visit. The health inspector stood with a clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable behind tinted glasses. Next to her, a uniformed officer shifted uncomfortably, as if he already knew this was a waste of time. We've received complaints, the inspector stated, flipping through her papers. Allegations of unsanitary conditions and improper food handling at Shaq's table. DeAndre, standing beside Shaq, let out a bitter laugh. You gotta be kidding me. I don't joke about food safety, the inspector replied coldly. I'm afraid we'll need to conduct a full inspection immediately. Until then, operations are suspended. Shaq felt a muscle twitch in his jaw. Suspended? Based on what? We've never had a single issue. The inspector didn't flinch. Based on multiple complaints filed anonymously. Shaq knew exactly who was behind it. He looked past the inspector, and there she was. Jessica Harper, standing just across the street, arms folded, a smug smirk on her face. She wasn't even hiding it. She wanted him to know she was responsible, and she wasn't done. 20 minutes later, a second patrol car pulled up. This time, the officer wasn't here for health violations. A tall, clean-shaven cop stepped out, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. He approached Shaq with the kind of controlled authority that immediately put people on edge. Mr. O'Neill? Shaq nodded. What's this about? The officer glanced at his notepad, then back at Shaq. We've received a complaint about mismanaged funds and stolen donations. Mind if we ask you a few questions? Shaq's fingers curled into fists, not in anger, but in restraint. This was a setup, and he wasn't about to give them a reason to escalate it. DeAndre stepped in. Stolen donations? Man, that's a joke. We take cash, sure, but every penny goes right back into this place. The officer raised a brow. Mind if we take a look at your financial records? Shaq exhaled slowly. I got nothing to hide. Good, the officer replied. Because until we verify that, the food truck stays shut down. Shaq's heart sank. The one place people depended on for meals. Gone, just like that. Jessica watched from a distance, her lips curving into a satisfied smirk. You really think this is gonna stick? Her friend Margot, a fellow socialite who thrived on drama, raised a brow. Jessica laughed lightly, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. People believe anything if you say it with enough confidence. Margot pursed her lips. What's your deal with him anyway? Jessica's smile faltered for half a second before she covered it up. It's not personal, it's just business. Margot didn't buy it, but she knew better than to push. Jessica checked her phone, watching the angry tweets, news articles and videos spread like wildfire. Shaq's reputation wasn't just being questioned, it was being destroyed. Exactly as planned. As the sun dipped below the skyline, a homeless man sat near the curb, watching everything unfold. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by years on the street, but his eyes were sharp. Too sharp. His name was Eddie, and he had seen a lot in his time. But today? Today he had seen something dangerous. He had seen Jessica meeting with a man in a tailored suit the night before. The man had handed her a folder, something thick with papers. She had nodded, smiled, and walked away like a deal had just been sealed. Eddie clenched his fists. He knew a setup when he saw one. And this? This was a takedown. The question was, why? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? The night was too quiet. No hum of conversation, no sizzling from the grill, no scent of seasoned chicken filling the air. Big Shaq sat alone inside his now lifeless food truck, the metal walls cold and empty without the warmth of the people who had once lined up outside. His massive frame hunched over the counter, where he had served thousands of meals, his fingers idly tracing patterns on the steel surface. The health notice was still taped to the window, bright red letters screaming at him, closed until further notice. Shaq exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. How did it come to this? He had spent years trying to build something real, something that made a difference. He had poured his heart, his time, and his own money into this food truck. Not for recognition, not for profit, but because he knew what it felt like to be hungry. And now? Now the same people he had fought for were starting to doubt him. Shaq leaned back, staring at the ceiling, memories pulling him under like a rising tide. He could still hear his mother's voice, soft but firm, from a time when he was just a scared little boy. We'll eat tomorrow, baby. I promise. His stomach had ached, and the hunger had been unbearable. He remembered the way his mother had looked at him, eyes filled with pain because she had nothing left to give him. That night, Shaq had made a silent promise to himself. One day I'll make sure no kid ever feels the way I did. It had been his driving force, his purpose, the reason he had never let himself forget where he came from. Now, sitting in this empty truck, watching his reputation be torn apart piece by piece, he felt like he had failed that promise. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe people didn't really want help. Maybe they just wanted someone to blame. Outside, the neighborhood was changing. Where there had once been lines of families waiting for meals, there were now pockets of hushed conversations. People spoke in murmurs, their words laced with uncertainty. He always seemed like a good guy, one man whispered, arms crossed. But I mean, what if we were wrong? I don't know, a woman replied hesitantly. Jessica's video made some points. No one gives things away for free like that. But Shaq ain't never asked for anything, another voice cut in. Dude never even asked for credit, he just fed people. Still, someone else muttered, shaking their head. You know how these things go. Where there's smoke. The doubt had taken root. It didn't matter that Shaq had been there for them every single day. People weren't loyal to memories, they were loyal to the last thing they heard. And Jessica had made sure they heard exactly what she wanted them to. Back inside the truck, Shaq opened his laptop and scrolled through the news articles, the tweets, the endless flood of negativity. Food truck hero or fraud? Ex-NBA star under investigation. Community divided over Shaq's true intentions. The comments were worse. Knew he was too good to be true. If he's so generous, why is he taking cash donations? He played us all. Shaq exhaled sharply and slammed the laptop shut. He was done reading about his own downfall. The chair groaned as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His mother's words echoed in his mind, a memory from long ago. one of the last real conversations they'd ever had. When you do good, evil always fights back. She had been sick, too weak to even sit up in bed. He had been by her side, holding her hand, promising her he'd always do right by people. The question is, she had whispered, voice barely above a breath, do you fight harder? Shaq swallowed hard. Back then, the answer had been simple. Of course he would fight. Of course he would push forward. But now he didn't know anymore. What was the point of fighting for people who weren't sure they even wanted him to? A knock on the door startled him. Shaq didn't move at first, staring at the closed truck door, as if willing whoever it was to just leave. He didn't have the energy for more bad news. The knocking came again, firmer this time. With a deep sigh, he finally stood up, moving sluggishly toward the door before swinging it open. A homeless man stood outside, hands shoved into the pockets of his tattered coat. His eyes were sharp, focused, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Shaq recognized him. Eddie. He had seen Eddie around the neighborhood plenty of times, but the man had never spoken much. Just took his meal, gave a small nod of thanks, and went about his way. Tonight, though, Eddie looked like a man with something to say. I know who did this to you, Eddie said simply. Shaq blinked, caught off guard by the directness. What? Eddie glanced around, lowering his voice. I know who set you up. Shaq stared, trying to gauge whether Eddie was serious or just another person with a conspiracy theory. Eddie took a step closer, his voice steady. I saw her, he said. Jessica. Last night. She met up with some dude in a fancy suit. He gave her a folder. She smiled like she just won the lottery. Shaq's muscles tensed. You sure? Eddie gave a grim nod. 100%. Whatever's in that folder. That's what she's using to tear you down. For the first time in days, Shaq felt something other than exhaustion. He felt anger. Not reckless anger, but the kind that focused, sharpened. He had been so close to giving up, so close to walking away, but now he had something real to hold on to. A lead. A reason. A fight. Eddie met his gaze. I ain't got proof yet, but I'll get it. You just don't quit on us yet, all right? Shaq didn't respond right away. He just looked out toward the neighborhood, the same neighborhood that once trusted him, now torn between believing in him and turning against him. Then, slowly, he nodded. Because his mother had been right. Evil always fought back. Now, it was his turn to fight harder. The air in Hollowbrook had shifted. It wasn't just the whispers anymore, or the way people avoided looking Shaq in the eye. There was a lingering tension, an unspoken unease settling over the neighborhood like a thick fog. Shaq could feel it, the way the weight of suspicion still clung to him, despite everything he had done for these streets. The doubt had been planted, and it had taken root. But doubt wasn't proof, and proof was what he needed. Shaq had spent the last few days replaying Eddie's words in his head. I saw her meeting with some suit guy 2 nights ago. Said something about clearing the street. That was the moment Shaq knew Jessica Harper wasn't working alone. But the real question was why. The answer came in the form of Carter Brooks. Shaq first heard the name when DeAndre stormed into the truck, eyes wide, shoving his phone into Shaq's hands. Bro, you need to see this. Shaq squinted at the screen, watching a video interview pop up under the headline, Hollowbrook Scandal, What They Don't Want You to Know. The clip opened on a man in his mid-30s, sharp eyes, dark brown hair slightly disheveled, sitting at a desk littered with papers and coffee cups. His voice was smooth but carried an undeniable edge of urgency. This is Carter Brooks, DeAndre explained. Independent journalist. Dude's not tied to any big networks, just digs into stuff people don't want found. Shaq raised a brow, watching as Carter leaned forward, staring into the camera. People like Jessica Harper don't destroy lives for fun, Carter said. They do it for profit. Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. Carter continued. I've been investigating land acquisitions in Hollowbrook for months. The pattern's always the same. Small businesses mysteriously shut down, health violations, financial fraud claims, city permits revoked. And every time, within weeks, the property is sold to the same real estate development firm. Hollister and Crane Investments. DeAndre whistled low. Man, that's the same company that's been buying out half the block. Shaq felt his stomach drop. Carter went on. The latest business they've targeted? A community food truck run by former NBA star Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq's blood ran cold. Carter's voice hardened. The accusations against Shaq are flimsy at best, but they don't have to be solid. They just have to be loud enough to shut him down. The food truck is sitting on prime real estate, and if history repeats itself, Hollister and Crane will be taking ownership of that spot in a matter of weeks. DeAndre shook his head. Bro, they want your land. Shaq set the phone down, his jaw clenching. He wasn't just being attacked, he was being erased. And Jessica? She was just the mouthpiece. It didn't take long to find Carter. Shaq didn't like reporters. Most of them twisted the truth to fit whatever sold the best headlines. But Carter was different. He had reached out first. A simple text. I know what they're doing to you. Meet me. So here he was, sitting in the back booth of a rundown diner, watching Carter Brooks stir his coffee like he had all the time in the world. I was wondering when you'd show up, Carter mused, glancing up. Thought maybe you'd given up. Shaq folded his arms. Not in my DNA. Carter smirked. Good. Because you're gonna need that fight. Shaq leaned in. Tell me everything. Carter took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down, lacing his fingers together. Hollister and Crane have been quietly buying out properties in Hollowbrook for 2 years. They start by driving small businesses into the ground. Health violations, financial scandals, whatever sticks. Then, once the business is ruined, they buy up the space for dirt cheap. Shaq gritted his teeth. And Jessica? Carter shrugged. Corporate pawn. She's the face of the outrage. The one who makes it look like the community is turning against you. She builds the fire, and once it's hot enough, the real players swoop in and take what they want. Shaq exhaled slowly. Carter tilted his head. You pissed off the wrong people. Shaq smirked despite himself. Or maybe they pissed off the wrong one. Carter laughed. That's what I was hoping to hear. The next step? Proof. Eddie came through faster than expected. Shaq found him outside the old Hollowbrook library, huddled under the awning, hands stuffed into his coat. You got something for me? Shaq asked. Eddie nodded, fishing out an old beat-up phone from his pocket. He hesitated for just a second before handing it over. Recorded it the night before your truck got shut down, Eddie said. Jessica, the suit, the whole damn setup. Shaq played the video. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Jessica, standing in the dim glow of a streetlight, talking to a man in an expensive suit. Just make sure it gets shut down, Jessica was saying. Once it's out of the way, we move forward. Shaq's jaw tightened. The man nodded. You'll have your share when it's done. And make sure people stay angry. That's the only way this works. The clip ended. Shaq's pulse hammered in his ears. This was it. This was proof. He turned to Eddie. You just gave me the ammo I needed. Eddie smirked. I figured you'd know what to do with it. But before Shaq could make his move, Jessica struck first. That night, a new headline hit the news. Shaq's dark secret. Where did the money really go? Jessica had gone full throttle, spinning a brand new scandal. Fake receipts, mismanaged donations, leaked bank statements, doctored but convincing. They weren't just smearing his reputation anymore. They were trying to bury him alive. And unless Shaq moved fast, they just might succeed. The air in Hollowbrook was charged, thick with anticipation and the weight of something about to break. People gathered in the town square, filling the space in front of a makeshift stage where cameras were already rolling. News vans lined the streets, reporters adjusting their mics, waiting for the story of the day to unfold. At the center of it all, standing behind a polished podium with manufactured confidence, was Jessica Harper. Dressed in a crisp white blazer, her hair styled to perfection, she stood before the microphones like she was about to deliver the gospel truth. Behind her, a large banner hung in bold red letters, exposing the fraud, the truth about Shaq's table. She gripped the edges of the podium, took a dramatic breath, then let her poisonous words spill into the microphone. Big Shaq isn't a hero, he's a con artist. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes flickered like lightning. Jessica's voice grew stronger, more animated, her words slicing through the air like daggers. For weeks, he's been taking your donations, funneling money into his own accounts while pretending to help this community. But the truth is, he's been helping himself. People shifted uneasily. Some whispered to each other. Others folded their arms, skeptical, but listening. Jessica's lips curled into a victorious smirk. She had them. She had everyone. Or at least she thought she did. A sudden commotion in the crowd made heads turn. From the back of the square, Shaq stepped forward, flanked by Carter Brooks and Eddie. The tension spiked instantly. People gasped, cameras swiveled. Jessica's smirk wavered, but she recovered quickly, tilting her chin upward in mock confidence. Oh, look who decided to show up, she purred. Come to defend yourself, Shaq. Shaq didn't take the bait. Instead, Carter stepped forward, calm and calculated. holding a USB drive between his fingers like a loaded gun. Actually, Carter said, his voice carrying over the crowd, we came to expose you. A low ripple of confusion spread through the audience. Reporters leaned forward. Jessica's expression tightened for the first time. Shaq crossed his arms, his towering presence alone sending a message. Let's cut the act, Jessica, he said, voice steady. We both know who the real fraud is here. Jessica laughed, shaking her head. This is pathetic, she scoffed. You're done, Shaq. The world already knows the truth. Carter smirked. Actually, they don't. But they're about to. He lifted the USB. Play the video. Across the square, DeAndre stood near a giant LED screen, laptop already connected. The second Carter gave the signal, DeAndre hit play. Jessica's face drained of color. The video flickered to life. And suddenly, the entire crowd was watching a grainy but damning recording. Jessica stood beneath a streetlight, her face illuminated just enough to make it undeniably clear it was her. And beside her? A man in an expensive suit, the real estate developer, Hollister and Crane's top executive. Then her voice, clear as day. If we get rid of him, we get the block. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Jessica visibly stiffened, her nails digging into the podium. On screen, the video continued. The man nodded. You'll have your share when it's done. And make sure people stay angry. That's the only way this works. More gasps, murmurs, disbelief. Jessica reached for the microphone, desperate to regain control. This is taken out of context, she snapped. This is fake. It's... Cut the lies, Jessica, Shaq interrupted, his voice booming. You played this whole neighborhood. You used their trust, their fear, just so you and your rich friends could profit. A man in the crowd, one of Jessica's former supporters, shook his head in disbelief. You lied to us? He shouted. A domino effect followed. More voices rose in anger. We believed you. You set him up. Jessica's perfectly crafted facade shattered in real time. The reporters, once hanging onto her words, now swarmed her like vultures. Jessica, do you deny these accusations? Were you working with real estate developers to shut down small businesses? Did you fabricate the allegations against Big Shaq? Jessica's eyes darted wildly, searching for a way out. She turned toward the police officers nearby, her last desperate attempt. Arrest him, she barked, pointing at Shaq. He still stole money. He's a criminal. One of the officers, the same one who had questioned Shaq before, stepped forward. Actually, he said, his voice unreadable, we ran a second audit on Shaq's finances. Jessica froze. The officer pulled out a file. Turns out, he continued, his books are clean. Every dollar donated went exactly where it was supposed to. Jessica stumbled back. No, that's not possible. The officer's expression hardened. But you, Miss Harper? He held up a separate folder. We have evidence that you accepted large, unexplained deposits from Hollister and Crane. Jessica's breath hitched. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Then, someone yelled from the back, Lock her up! A wave of agreement followed. Yeah, she's the real crook. She tried to ruin a man's life for money. Jessica staggered, realizing there was nowhere left to run. The officers moved in, their hands resting near their cuffs. Jessica Harper, one of them announced. You're under investigation for conspiracy to commit fraud and defamation. Jessica let out a choked laugh, wild-eyed. You think you've won? She spat. You think this changes anything? Shaq looked her dead in the eye. This ain't about winning, he said. It's about justice. Jessica opened her mouth, but no more words came out. The officers led her away from the stage as the cameras captured every second of her downfall. Shaq turned back to the crowd. For a moment there was stillness. Then, the first clap, then another, and another. And before he knew it, the entire square erupted into applause. Shaq exhaled, feeling the weight of weeks of hell finally lifting. Eddie clapped a hand on his shoulder. Told you, he murmured. People just needed to see the truth. Shaq nodded, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. And this time, it wasn't going anywhere. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within hours of Jessica Harper's spectacular downfall, the world turned on her just as fast as it had once propped her up. The video evidence of her corrupt deal with Hollister and Crane went viral, circulating on news networks, social media, and even late-night talk shows. She had spent weeks fueling the flames against Shaq, but now, she was the one burning. The next morning, Jessica sat in her high-rise apartment, staring at her phone as notification after notification piled up like wreckage from a crash. Disgraced activist exposed for fraud. Jessica Harper, from hero to con artist. How greed destroyed her career. She clenched her jaw, scrolling through the endless stream of comments. I used to respect her. Now, just another scammer. Can't believe I defended this woman. Shaq was out here feeding people, and she was out here trying to buy real estate? Hope she never works again. A loud buzz snapped her out of her haze. She grabbed the phone and answered. Hello? A tense silence on the other end. Then a clipped professional voice. Jessica. We're done. Her stomach dropped. Mr. Crane, wait. You're a liability. He cut her off. You think I want my name attached to this disaster? Consider our association terminated. Jessica sat there, stunned. She had done everything they asked. Turned public opinion, shut down Shaq's food truck, built a scandal so airtight it should have buried him. And yet, the second things went south, they had thrown her to the wolves. The call ended abruptly, leaving her staring at the blank screen. And then, another notification. Her company, the one that had prided itself on its community outreach, had just released a public statement. Jessica Harper has been terminated effective immediately. We do not condone her actions. Jessica's breath hitched. Her career was gone. The people she had used as pawns, gone. She had played the game ruthlessly, but she had forgotten one rule. When you make enough enemies, there's no one left to save you. Meanwhile, across town, a very different scene unfolded. Shaq stood outside his food truck, staring at the crowd gathered in front of him. It was larger than before, 3 times the size of what it used to be. Word had spread about what really happened, and now the people who had once whispered in doubt were standing in line to support him. Mr. Shaq, what are your plans now? A reporter held a microphone toward him, surrounded by a sea of news cameras and flashing lights. Shaq exhaled, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Some were the same people who had questioned him weeks ago. Some were new faces, people who had come to stand by him now that the truth had been revealed. He let a small smile break across his face. My plan? He turned toward his food truck, running a hand across its surface like greeting an old friend. To get back to work. That afternoon, Shaq's table officially reopened. The line stretched down the block, people waiting patiently as DeAndre fired up the grill and Maria prepared meals with practiced efficiency. Eddie stood nearby, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, watching as Shaq handed out the first plate of the day. You know, Eddie said, smirking. I think people like a comeback story almost as much as they like a scandal. Shaq chuckled, handing a plate to an elderly woman who squeezed his hand in thanks. Good thing, Shaq replied, because we just gave them one. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the street, the rush finally started to slow down. Shaq wiped his brow, taking a moment to breathe. Then, he felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. He looked down. A little girl stood in front of him, her big brown eyes wide with hesitation. She clutched a paper plate in her small hands. Mr. Shaq? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq knelt down to her level, his expression softening. Yeah, sweetheart? She bit her lip, then held up her plate. Can I have some more? Shaq felt his heart clench, because once upon a time, he had been that kid. The one too scared to ask for more. The one who knew what hunger felt like too well. Shaq smiled, then carefully placed an extra helping onto her plate. As much as you want, sweetheart, he said, giving her a gentle wink. The little girl's face lit up, and she clutched the plate tightly before running back to her mother. Shaq watched her go, his chest tight with emotion. No matter what had happened, no matter what they had tried to take from him, this was why he did it, and no one could ever take that away from him again. Big Shaq stood for something bigger than himself, helping those in need, no matter the cost. His story isn't just fiction, it's a reminder that good still exists, and that one person can make a difference. Want to be part of something bigger? Support local businesses, stand up against injustice, and give back to your community. Share this story, start a conversation, and let's build a world where kindness wins over greed. Follow us for more powerful stories that inspire change.